Welcome to the Jason Allen Scott Show. I am Jason Allen Scott. This episode is about the $500 gamble that built a $1 trillion company. It's the Steve Jobs story. I'm Jason Allen Scott. I've been in business for 35 years. I've sold or been involved in 9 exits, started 11 companies, 1 fiasco, and run a 7-figure solo business with no staff. And I've distilled everything I've learned from experiences in 3 decades of building businesses into lessons that truly matter for achieving a rich life. And this podcast, by the way, is part of that. It's the biographies, the people's lives that I've read that have allowed me to avoid certain things and go hard on other things. That's why I thought I would start season 1 with biographies. And that would not be possible if it wasn't for our mainline sponsor, which is www.pitchcapital.com. Pitchcapital.com is our headline sponsor, and I've said this before in multiple episodes. I wish I had this 20 years ago when I raised capital. And I've only raised capital twice, but I have been on both sides of the table. I have invested in companies, 3 to date, and I've raised company twice, as I mentioned, once through a podcast for 2.1 million and once over 5 days for $1 million. But I speak to so many of my friends who are entrepreneurs and in startups, and so many clients because I consult for businesses making between 100K and 10 million, and they struggle in the fundraising process, saying it is brutal, that it takes 6 to 12 months of their life. It's grinding through decks, emails, rejections, and meetings that go nowhere. And you know this if you've ever raised capital. Well, pitchcapital.com is the world's first AI fundraising platform that automates your entire capital raising journey. You simply upload your business details, and in 90 seconds, you've got an investor-ready pitch and financial models. Their AI matches you with the right investors from pre-seed to Series C+. It handles everything from outreach, it books the meetings, you can even close deals through their secure escrow system. So what they're doing really is compressing 6 to 12 months of nightmares into something that's actually efficient. If you're raising capital, do check them out. Now, let me tell you about the most valuable lesson I ever learned. Episode 6, the $500 gamble that built a $1 trillion company. Steve Jobs. I'm getting into this, can you tell? Okay. What if the most revolutionary thing you could do wasn't inventing something new, but refusing to compromise on how things should work? Everyone's got a Steve Jobs story, and I feel like everyone knows the Steve Jobs story. So I wanted to find a story of Steve Jobs that you probably know nothing about, but that links really well, red string theory, with all the biographies of all the founders that are found here on season 1 of this podcast. So listen carefully to this little story that I found, this little gem amongst a sea of stories that I felt everyone knew about. Steve Jobs once told a young engineer, "A hardware keyboard seems like an easy solution, but it's constraining. Let's bet on a software keyboard, and then we'll find a way to make it work." Everyone thought he was crazy. Now remember, at the time, the BlackBerry dominated the market. Physical keyboards were a proven technology that worked. The iPhone, redefining an industry. This brings me to today's source material, Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, the authorized biography based on over 40 interviews with Jobs himself, plus hundreds more with his family, friends, colleagues, and competitors. This is the story of Steve Jobs, not the mythology of the lone genius, but the method behind the method behind the mania, the maniac, and the madness. This is a story of how one man's obsession with end-to-end integration didn't just create great products, but it reveals that the future belongs to those who can control the entire experience, not just the individual components. What does that remind you of, those proper long-time listeners and viewers of the show? Well, the episode just before this, the episode with Leonardo Del Vecchio, the $1 trillion, his company's worth a couple of billion. It's not $1 trillion. But if you consider that he sold 3% of his business for $3.5 billion, could I say it's a $1 trillion company? Yes, I can. So here it is. Leonardo Del Vecchio is obsessed with owning every single part, an integrated end-to-end system, from building to selling to where it's sold to whom it's sold. He controls everything. And Steve Jobs is exactly the same. So that's why I wanted to do Steve Jobs as the next episode, even though, again, I found it so hard to find stories that you probably haven't heard of Steve. But I'm hoping this episode does itself justice. But what this episode will also do is it will reveal a future that we can all move into, where the future belongs to those who control the entire experience and not just the individual components. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to accept that hardware, software, and content must remain separate. I want you to think about that again. We're about to change the way you think. At least that's the goal of this entire series. All the series I'll do going forward. Act 1, the spark that changed everything. The article that changed 2 lives. It was Sunday. It was a Sunday afternoon in 1971, and Steve Wozniak was at home when his mother leaves an Esquire article on the kitchen table. For those that don't know, for those who are too young, Esquire is a magazine. Magazine is a book of pages and papers with words in it and photographs. It's kind of like your phone, but on paper from a tree, which is outside. In this place called the world, which many of you don't know because you live on your phones and on laptops and computer screens. Anyway, the story describes how hackers and phone freakers, that was the word they used, by the way, phone freakers, which is probably what we all are now. Freakers, by the way, spelled Phreakers. Phone freakers had found a way to make long-distance calls for free by replicating the tones that routed signals on the AT&T network. And a couple of things. If you're not American, you might not know AT&T is like their biggest network, I believe. I'm not American, but I've watched a lot of American movies, so this is what I've understood. And also, if you're old enough, and I'm old AF, you will know that back in the day, all that happened everywhere was noises. You turn on a computer and it would make a massive noise. You would try to dial up and it would be a... The same came with faxes. Same came with photocopies. It was just a very noisy world. And these phone freakers had realized that if they just replicate these tones, they could route signals and get free calls. And this was massive at the time. And Wozniak is halfway through this article when he realizes this is not only a real thing, but this is a real thing that can be built, that he can build, because he is a genius. So what does he do? He calls his best friend Steve Jobs. This is me replicating a rotary phone for those people who are not watching me make stupid faces on the internet or on YouTube or on Spotify for creators. He literally has to do this thing. And again, they were like 9 to 12 digits, 513, 592. That was the first phone number I ever learned. I was 5 years old. I still remember it now. 10 times that age. But because of how long it took, it was that repetition, that rote memory, which, by the way, for years until I was 35, I thought was rope memory because I thought it was like knots on a rope that you memorized each one and you understood the journey of distance between them. Nonetheless, he calls up Steve and he says to him, "You're going to have to wait and find out." The article's hero is a guy called John Draper, nicknamed Captain Crunch, because he discovered that the toy whistle from the Captain Crunch cereal emitted the exact 2,600 hertz tone used by phone networks' call routing switches. It could fool the system into allowing long-distance calls without charges. For those that can't even imagine what this is, rent a John Wick film. I think it's from John Wick 2, where you see the girls, and I believe they are all women, as telephone operators, moving these cables across. They're basically moving the networks, these hertz tones from hole to hole using these little prompters. Again, if you're a technical person, please in the comments, let me know what this is actually called and what they're actually doing. But this, if you want to visualize it, and I'm hoping that people visualize my stories, then that's what I want you to visualize. The article goes on to mention that other routing tones could also be found in an issue of Bell Systems' Technical Journey. Apologies. In an issue, basically a book called Bell Systems Technical Journal, which AT&T was frantically asking libraries to remove from their shelves. Jobs picks up Wozniak's call, but he also, more importantly, picks up what Wozniak is laying down. They drive to the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center library. We were furiously digging through the stacks, Jobs recalls, and it was Woz who finally found the journal with all the frequencies inside. Can you imagine how exciting that must be? That must be like if you're a Gen X and you go to the library after watching The Never-Ending Story and you find the book that is The Never-Ending Story. This would be a great opportunity for my producer to add the music of The Never-Ending Story. The Never-Ending Story. In fact, in case we can't afford the copyright. Anyway, it was like a holy shiza moment. We opened it up and there it was. And we kept saying to ourselves, it's real. Holy shiza, it's real. They wouldn't use the word shiza, but I'm trying to keep this a PG-friendly show. No one had ever created an additional version of a blue box. The blue box, by the way, was the device that the phone freakers used to make free calls. But Wozniak was made for this challenge. Using diodes and transistors from Radio Shack. Radio Shack was a shop that sold parts. I don't know if they still do. Moving on. With the help of a music student who had perfect pitch, the Charlie Puth at the time, he built it. They called Wozniak's uncle in Los Angeles, wait for it, oh, got it wrong, let me try again. Anyway, got the wrong number. Didn't matter. Slammed the phone down. Hi. They finally got him. Hi. We're calling you for free. We're calling you for free. Wozniak shouted at the phone. This confused the person on the other end. As mentioned earlier, if you were paying attention, they didn't get through to his uncle. What? Said the other person. Probably more like this. What? Jobs chimed in. We're calling from California with a blue box. This must have baffled the man even more, since he was also in California. But here's what matters. Jobs immediately saw beyond the hobby. I got together the rest of the components, the casing and power supply and keypads, and figured out how we could price it. Now, this is a very integral, beautiful word, part of the story, because Wozniak is the builder, but Jobs is the marketer. Wozniak is the builder, and Jobs is the business, if you will. One is, to quote Sean Carter? Yeah, Jay-Z. One is a business, and one is a businessman. Parts, $40. Jobs price, $150. Lesson. Note the profit, $90. If you're building a business, always look at profit, okay? Parts cost, $40. Jobs price, $150. They made 100 blue boxes and sold almost all of them. The partnership template was established. Wozniak would invent something neat. He'd happily give it away for free, but Jobs would figure out how to make it user-friendly, how to package it, how to market it, and most importantly, how to make money from it. Jobs later reflected, if it hadn't been for the blue boxes, there'd never have been an Apple. I'm 100% sure of that. Woz and I learned how to work together, and we gained the confidence that we could solve technical problems and actually put something into production. Seth Godin, famous, the godfather of marketing, he does a whole thing about this, about Ship It. I think that's the name of the book and the process. But it's this idea of just making something and getting it out and all the lessons you learn from doing that. And if you do that with someone, well, then you also gain confidence, not in yourself, but in your partnership to be able to create something, market it, and sell it, and ship it. They had created a device with a circuit board that could control billions of dollars of infrastructure. The confidence that this gave them was simply immeasurable. The $500 sale that built Apple. 1975, P.S., the year I was born. Wozniak builds a small computer. Jobs realizes they can sell it. Paul Terrell had just opened a computer store called the Byte Shop. Byte, B-Y-T-E. People were so smart back then. When Jobs gave him a private demo, Terrell was impressed. He was impressed enough to hand over his card and say, "Keep in touch, kids." The next day, Jobs walked barefoot into the Byte Shop. "I'm keeping in touch," he announced. Terrell saw it, and Terrell ordered 50 computers. With one condition. He didn't want circuit boards that customers would have to assemble themselves. Sure, that appealed to hardcore hobbyists, but not most customers. He wanted fully assembled boards. By the way, shout out to Terrell, who realized the average person just doesn't have the time. Not even back then, when they had more than enough time. They had no doom scrolling. But he just knew that people wanted ease, convenience. And by the way, if you're building a business, those are some of the fundamental pillars of which to build a business on. Can you make it easy? Can you make it fast? Can you make it cheap? Try and get 2 out of 3 of those bad boys. You're halfway there. He said, if you can do that, I'd happily pay $500 a piece, and I'll pay you cash on delivery. This sale taught Jobs a lesson he never, ever forgot. End-to-end integration. As Jobs walked the floor of the Personal Computer Festival, he came to the realization that Paul Terrell of the Byte Shop had been right. Personal computers should come in a complete package. His vision: create the first fully packaged computer. We were no longer aiming for the handful of hobbyists who like to assemble their own computers. For every one of them, there would be 1,000 people who would want the machine ready to run the moment it arrived. Steve's onto something. Well, Terrell is leading him somewhere. That idea became the machine that Apple would call the Apple II. And it launched the personal computer industry. Apple sold close to 6 million of these over the next 16 years, more than any other machine of its era. If you're listening to this right now on an iPhone, understand that. Understand that integrated vision never left Jobs. The device in your hand or in your pocket or in your jacket, most likely your back pocket of your jeans, is the complete demonstration of the philosophy formed when he was just 20 years old. The IPO that changed nothing. December 12th, 1980. Apple goes public. The stock opens at $22 and jumps to $29 on the very first day. Jobs is 25, and he's now worth $256 million. His attitude towards wealth is complex. He was an anti-materialistic hippie who capitalized on the invention of a friend who wanted to give them away for free. But he was also a Zen devotee who made a pilgrimage to India and then decided his calling was to create a business. Yet somehow these attitudes wove together rather than conflicted. They were so polar opposite that somehow they made sense. By the way, if you're paying attention and you are watching this, you'll notice I'm wearing black and white. Again, I try and wear something to remind myself of the story to which I tell. I believe these are called anchors. They help me. I just thought I'd bring that up for anyone that's noticing the Easter eggs in these episodes. Jobs bought nice cars, but he drove them himself. He never traveled with an entourage. He kept no personal staff and had no security protection. His houses, no matter how rich he became, were furnished simply. They would have put a shaker to shame, was his own words. I think what he means by that is just they were absolutely utilitarian. They were beauty and use, but mostly focused on use. 30 years after the IPO, he reflected, I never worried about money. I learned at Atari, by the way, Atari was like the biggest game company in the world, that I could be an okay engineer. So I always knew I could get by. I was voluntarily poor when I was in college and when I went to India. So I went from fairly poor, which was wonderful because I didn't have to worry about money, to being incredibly rich when I also didn't have to worry about money. I love that. It reminds me of a mentor I had, a guy called Felix Dennis, who said, I went from being too poor to learn how to drive a car to being too rich to never needing to learn how to drive a car. I watched people at Apple who made a lot of money and felt they had to live differently. Some bought a Rolls Royce and various houses, each with a house manager and then someone to manage the house managers. Their wives got plastic surgery and turned into bizarre people. This is not how I wanted to live. It's crazy. I made a promise to myself that I'm not going to let the money ruin my life. This is interesting. I get asked this quite a lot. I don't own anything, or I own very little. I do own things. I am a slave to fashion. I like clothes. I like holidays. I like really nice hotels, good luggage, some nice items that last me a lifetime that hopefully I can give away before I die. In fact, I will give away every single thing I own before I die. That is one of my goals that I will complete. But if you listen to these biographies, you realize it is an hedonic treadmill. That's the words you'll hear. Now, what does that mean? It just means, imagine a treadmill, right? As much as you run, as fast as you run, you don't get anywhere. And that's exactly what you see with these people that get all this money. They change their life. By upgrading their lives, they suddenly aren't rich anymore. It's like when friends of mine sell a house. They're like, I bought the house for $200K and then I sold it for $1.2 million. I've made $1 million. I'm like, have you? Because I guarantee the next house you buy is $2.5 million. So you're back in debt just for a larger amount of money. But this is a crucial understanding that you need to have about Jobs. Money was never his motivation. Creating great products was the motivation. Money just enabled him to keep creating great products. You'll notice in these biographies, there's two kinds of entrepreneur. There is the missionary and there's the mercenary. And Steve is very much the missionary. Act 2. The red string, the integration obsession. What we see in Jobs' story reveals a pattern completely different from some of the patterns we've seen and will see in this series. From Ford, Edison, Disney, or Walton, the competitive advantage of integrated systems over modular components. Ford integrates manufacturing. Edison integrates invention and production. Disney integrates creative control. Walton will integrate information gathering and simplification. Jobs integrates everything. Hardware, software, content, retail, services. Not because he's a control freak, although he was, but because he understood something fundamental about the user experience. Magic happens at the seams. Again, I'm wearing a jersey full of holes. The holes kind of make the jersey. It makes me feel warm. It makes me feel worn and warm. That there's some sort of magic in the holes, in the fact that the seams weren't strong enough to hold the fabric for long periods of time, even though it's a fairly new jersey. But there's magic in those connections. And without those connections, things break, things tear, things become frail. And he understood this. He understood this in a way that no other visionary seemed to. On the subject of vision, this next chapter is called The Exile That Redefined the Vision and Refined It Completely. It's 1985. Jobs, by the way, if you're paying attention, is now 30 years old. The board of Apple forces him out of the company he founded. He'd recruited John Scully from Pepsi with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Can you hear that? That is cinematic. That is cinematic, right? It's the thing you would expect to hear from Captain America on an Avengers set. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? Scully came, and then Scully fired him. Jobs' response wasn't bitterness. It was prophecy. In an interview he later did for Playboy, the month he turned 30, in fact, he said, "I'll always stay connected with Apple. I hope that throughout my life, the thread of my life and the thread of Apple weave in and out of each other, like a tapestry. There may be a few years when I'm not there, but I'll always come back." If you want to live your life in a creative way as an artist, you have to not look back too much. You have to be willing to take whatever you've done and whoever you were and throw them away. The more the outside world tries to reinforce an image of you, the harder it is to continue to be an artist. Without knowing it, Steve Jobs is describing his own future. Next, Jobs founds a company called Next. Big N, small e, large X, large T. A computer company targeting universities. Beautiful machines, far too expensive. Generally considered a failure. But the software that Next develops would eventually become the foundation of the Mac operating system X. By the way, he also bought Pixar from George Lucas for $10 million. Lucas was going through a bitter divorce and just needed cash. Jobs got the deal of a lifetime. For a decade, Jobs ran both companies, and it nearly killed him. He said in his own words, "I'd go back to work at 7 a.m. and I'd get back at 9 at night, and the kids would be in bed. I couldn't speak. I was exhausted. I literally couldn't speak. I would watch half an hour of TV and vegetate, and it got close to killing me." But this exile refined his integration philosophy, because at Next he controlled everything and failed. At Pixar, he deferred to the artist and artists and succeeded spectacularly. The lesson? Integration works when it serves the product, not the ego. The competitor who saw it differently. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs knew each other from their 20s until Jobs' death. The relationship was complex, competitive, occasionally collaborative, and revealed the fundamental divide in computing philosophy. Gates visited Next headquarters in 1987. Jobs kept him waiting half an hour in the lobby. Even though Gates could see through glass walls that Jobs was just walking around chatting. Steve Jobs' ego was bigger than his bank account. When he finally met, Jobs pitched straight into it. "We did the Mac together. How did that work out for you?" "Very well. Now we're going to do this together, and this is going to be great." But maybe he pushed too hard, because Gates was brutal. "This machine is crap. The optical disc has no high latency. The effing case is too expensive. This thing is ridiculous." He decided Next made no sense for Microsoft. Then he said, publicly, "Develop for it? Ha! I'll pee on it." Again, isn't that a different Bill Gates to the cuddly, cardigan-wearing, occasionally visiting Epstein Island, genius billionaire that we see today? When they met at a conference, Jobs started berating Gates for refusing to make software for Next. Gates, expressionless as Jobs got more heated, finally said, "When you get a market, I'll consider it." Jobs got angrier. "It was a screaming battle right in front of everybody," recalled Adele Goldberg from Xerox PRC. Beneath their rivalry was a philosophical difference. Jobs believed in end-to-end integration of hardware and software, and Gates believed in, and profited, by the way, from a world where different companies made compatible machines running standard software. At a 1989 forum, they laid out their competing visions. Jobs: "Every major software vendor realized they had to be part of a new wave, except one, Microsoft." Bill Gates. Gates said, "The hardware market and the software market are separate." When asked about the great design from Jobs' integration approach, Gates gestured to the Next prototype and sneered, "If you want black, I'll get you a can of paint." By the way, if you're paying attention, history proved Jobs right. Apple became the world's most valuable company. Microsoft became mostly irrelevant in Jobs' later assessment. But Gates made more money. which revealed that Jobs' actual priority, he didn't care about being the richest. He just cared about being right. The return that saved everything. 1996. Apple is dying. They've tried multiple CEOs. They've created dozens of mediocre products, and on 90 days, 3 months from insolvency, their board begs Jobs to return. Not as a CEO, but as an advisor. They'll pay Gilles Amelio, the current CEO, to run things. Jobs can just come in and help with products. And Jobs agrees. Then immediately, Machiavellianly, begins maneuvering to take over. Machiavelli, as a side note, was a guy in a crazy time in Italy who wrote a little book called The Prince. And it was all about politics and politicking. I don't think he particularly was a bad guy. I think he just noticed how you could do things thinking like a chess player and not a checker player, 3 moves ahead as opposed to 1 jump at a time, and then put it all down in paper when everyone else was too scared to, and now we constantly refer to the guy like he was the devil himself. Personally, I don't think he was. But great word, Machiavelli. Fantastic word used in a sentence, Machiavellian, and immediately gives us an image in our heads of what is going on here. Hence, I also liked it with the word maneuvering because, the 2 M's. It's very cool, M&M. When the board finally fires Emilio and begs Jobs to become CEO, Jobs initially refuses. He says, hell no. I'll be an advisor. Unpaid. That's all I can give. Why the hesitation? He talks to Andy Grove at Intel. He explains the pros and cons. Grove interrupts immediately. Steve, I don't give a shizer about Apple. Jobs is stunned. It was then I realized that I do give a shizer about Apple. I started it. And it's a good thing to have in the world, said Steve Jobs in his own words. He agrees to become interim CEO. That interim status lasts 3 years. Then he officially takes the job. Wait for it. He takes the job on a condition. He gets paid $1 a year salary. Mic drop. I bet you none of you expected that, by the way. Just let me put that out there. Again, trying to find little gems, things you didn't know about Steve Jobs, things you didn't know about the Steve Jobs story. Because there's so much about his story. But there's still so much we don't know. Things that are really important, by the way, that explain how one is a missionary, one is a mercenary, what is that in business? First action, simplify. Apple had 12 versions of the Macintosh with confusing numbers. Steve Jobs grabbed a magic marker, drew 4 squares on a whiteboard. Consumer/pro in one column, desktop/portable in the next row. Here's what we need. 4 great products. 1 for each quadrant. That's it. Nothing else. He killed, which is a cool way of killing. He killed the Newton PDA. He fired 3,000 people. And he refocused on what mattered. In his first year back, Apple lost $1.4 billion. After 2 years, it was up $309 million in pure profit. Oh yeah, people were asking. And the only answer was, Steve Jobs was back. And so was Apple. Act 3, the one-person empire toolkit. Your inner integrator. So what can we learn from Steve Jobs? His obsessive integration philosophy. How do we, the individual, the normos out here, how do we channel his systematic thinking about becoming impossible to work with, or without becoming impossible to work with? Apologies. Well, first, integration starts with saying no. Steve Jobs' genius wasn't adding features, it was removing them. When designing the iPhone, some team members argued for a physical keyboard. As I said, BlackBerry proved people wanted them. And Jobs vetoed it. A hardware keyboard seems like an easy solution, but it's constraining. Think of all the innovations we've been able to adapt if we did the keyboard on screen with software. Let's bet on that, and we'll find a way to make it work. I say to this to people all the time. When I'm a business owner, entrepreneur, which I am, when I'm in that mode, and I do see them as different modes, not different parts of my life, because it's just my life, but there are different modes. I act as a composer. I don't face the audience and ask them for notes. I face my tools, my artists, my creatives, the team, my co-collaborators, and I know the music well enough to get the best pieces out of them. And we take away everything that doesn't count. This show is like that. There's no underlining music, creating more atmospheric moments. There's no green screen behind me. I'm not on a set. I'm not in my one house in LA and my other house in London or New York. I'm not all in black with a black background and hot chicken wings in front of me, although I'd like to do that. It's down to the stuff that counts, the story and the storyteller. Thank you, Adam Perry, for that quote, one of our listeners. How do you bring things down to what really, really counts and only focus on that? The result for Steve Jobs? The result for Apple? A device that displays a numerical pad when you dial, a keyboard when you type, video controls when you watch, all on the same screen. You see, by replacing hardware with software, the interface became both fluid and flexible. Microsoft's Steve Ballmer predicted failure. Oh my God, it's the most expensive phone in the world and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, he said. By the way, before we go and drop number twos on Mr. Ballmer has become a billionaire with a job, right? You know, people say to you can't get rich with a job. Ballmer is one of the richest people in the world and he did it with a job. Okay, so again, people say impossible, think improbable. In other words, they probably just don't know. And number two, everything makes sense with more information. And don't pick apart someone being a failure or a winner because of one moment in their lives. Much respect, Mr. Ballmer. By 2010, Apple had sold 90 million iPhones and captured more than half of the global cell phone market's profits. Again, how powerful is this word, profit? It didn't take half of the market's revenue because that doesn't mean anything to these companies. Not to companies who lost, not to companies who become the most valuable companies in the world, but the profit. The profit allows you runway. The profit allows you to care. The profit allows you to breathe. Integration requires courage to say no to proven approaches. The keyboard worked, but Jobs bet on something better. Elon Musk, love him or hate him, said when his kids have a problem with something, he doesn't hand them the solution. He asks them how they would fix it without ever knowing what the solution is. So if he says, I need to put a painting on a wall, he doesn't explain that the best way to do that is a hammer and a nail. Because he wants to see if they'll find another way to do that without knowing that a hammer or nail exists. This is first principle thinking. We hear this a lot reading business books and business magazines and business podcasts. But what it actually means is, can you see it straight from the problem? Jobs saw a problem with the keypad and thought the keypad isn't... We're trying to fix things from a keypad forward versus the solution first, and then what are the parts we need to make the solution more inevitable? I think that's incredible. Right? Like, again, let's go back. Let's go. Okay. If you go and look for pictures of the first astronauts going to space, you'll notice they are carrying their own luggage. Because at that period, when you had luggage, these big, heavy bags, you would get to a station or an airport or wherever, and you would throw it on a large plank with wheels at the bottom. A trolley. Bags would go on top, and people would carry the trolley to where they needed to go. It took a young Polish man to work out that why do we just put the wheels on the bags rather than the bags on something with wheels? How simple an idea, but he saw it from first principles. He saw it from how do we solve the problem without already knowing the solution? How do we work from the problem to the solution? And I want you to think about that. Where right now in your product are you accepting good enough? Because the alternative seems too risky, too complicated, too confusing. What hardware could become software? What rigid structure could become flexible? Second, control the entire experience or control nothing. Steve Jobs hated seeing great Apple software running on crappy hardware. He was allergic to unapproved apps, polluting the perfection of Apple devices. His words, not mine. That, ladies and gentlemen, thems and theirs, is not ego. That's caring about user experience. I want to quote Steve when he says, "My passion has been to build an enduring company where people were motivated to make great products. Everything else was secondary. Sure, it was great to make a profit, because that profit is what allowed us to make great products. But the products, not the profits, were the motivation." Again, why? Because he is a missionary, not a mercenary. Talking about mercenaries. When Bill Gates argued for modular systems, different companies making compatible hardware running Windows, he was optimized for market share. When Jobs argued for integrated systems, he was optimizing for user experience. Yes, Gates won the market share battle of the 1990s. But Steve Jobs won the profitability battle of the 2000s. One won the battle and one continues to win the war. The lesson? You can't deliver a magical experience if you only control part of the system. Either integrated vertically or accept mediocrity. Find a way to control every single part of your experience. Or accept that you'll always be middle of the road. Where are you depending on others to deliver parts of your customer experience? Where are you making compromises because integration just seems too hard? Jobs' answer? If you want to allow your products to be open to other hardware or software, you have to give up to some of your vision. You have to just give up on some of your vision. Why would anyone want to give up on some of their vision? Building a business is hard enough. Why allow anything to dilute your vision and the power of the solution that comes from your vision? Third, a player only wants to work with A players. I love this. A players only want to work with A players. Jobs was ruthless about talent. He was ruthless and honest about talent. When merging the Lisa and Macintosh teams, he stood before everyone and said, "You guys failed. You're a B team. You're B players. Too many people here are B or C players. Today, we are releasing some of you to have the opportunity to work at our sister companies in the Valley." Bill Atkinson, who worked on both teams, by the way, called it callous and unfair. But Jobs believed he'd learned a key management lesson. You have to be ruthless if you want to build a team of A players. It's too easy as a team grows to put up with a few B players. And guess what? B players, well, they attract other B players. And then soon you'll have C players to make the B players look like A players. The Macintosh experience taught me that A players like to work only with other A players, which means you cannot indulge in B players. That's brutal, but true. Great people don't want to carry mediocre people. They want to be pushed. They want to be challenged. They want to be elevated by those around them. By the way, years later, Jobs would refine this. He said, "I was hard on people sometimes, probably harder than I needed to be. I remember the time when Reed was 6 years old, coming home after I had just fired somebody that day, and I imagined what it was like for that person to tell his family and his young son that he had lost his job. It was hard, but somebody had to do it. I figured it was always my job to make sure the team was excellent." Where in your life right now, in your business, are you tolerating B players because firing them feels too hard? What message does that send to your A players? By the way, something personal. I feel this with friendships. I only want A player friendships. I won't tolerate B player friendships because B player friendships are just going to bring me more B player friends. My A player friends bring me A player friends. And I do have one A player friend who does occasionally hang out with B, C, D, E, F, and G players, but I don't. I'm very strict. I don't have anything more important than time and attention. Let me tell you a secret. Neither do you. And when you start hanging out with A players, everything changes. Your business changes. Your life changes. Your decisions change. It's crazy. I was talking to one of my clients, Fiona, who raised $2 billion, who was talking about building her company. And she said something incredible. She said, I just got electric cars because they're just better. And that was it. She said a lot of things. They were all incredible. But that line, that understanding of it's just better. I just thought, why shouldn't they drive electric cars? It's just better. Well, that's what it's like working with A players. It's just better. A player friendships, A player relationships, A player partnerships. It's just better. Try it. Let me know if I'm wrong. I'm hoping maybe in spite you do it and you find out that I'm right and your life is incredible. The next thing, number 4, if you're counting, that Steve said that I remind myself of constantly because I am fortunate enough to get some incredible offers and some incredible opportunities. Focus is about saying no to good ideas. Jobs' intensity was evident in his ability to focus. He would set priorities, aim his laser attention on them, and filter out every distraction. Did you know, another fact for today, that the word priority means to focus on one thing? It was bastardized later in the 80s, and I think more popularized in the 90s, when people added an S to it. Well, if you could focus on only one thing, why couldn't you focus on a bunch of one things? It's not true. It's like if you say, I have noses. You'd be like, that's wrong. Just because you've added an S to it doesn't make it right. You still have one nose. Except for the person out there that might have 2 noses. Apologies if you do have 2 noses. But let's talk generalization here. Priority. You have one priority. Filter out everything else, no matter how good it sounds. Priority. To focus on one thing. And focus. F. Follow. O. 1. C. Follow one course until successful. FOCUS. Focus. Some leaders push innovation by being good at the big picture. Others do so by mastering details. Steve Jobs, he did both. Relentlessly. When he returned to Apple, he had cut everything except core products. Not just bad products, by the way. He cut good products. But good products that didn't serve the vision. His design mantra was simple. It was featured on Apple's first brochure that he ever put out. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. By the way, if you look it up, it's probably attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. Which is also quite scary, by the way, because AI just looks at who said it the most on Reddit and says that's the person that said it. And you have to sometimes ask AI 6 times before it finally admits that, oh no, that wasn't actually that person. That person just said it a bunch of times on Reddit. But this focus allows Steve Jobs to say no. He says, I got Apple back on track by cutting all except a few core products. He made devices simpler by eliminating buttons, software simpler by eliminating features, and interfaces simpler by eliminating options. Most founders think their job is adding value. Jobs proved the opposite. Removing complexity is how you add value. Right now, a little true story. Just the other day, myself and our headline sponsor, www.pitchcapital.com, which is founded by an incredible man called Franco, had a disagreement. I wanted the tagline to be dead simple for his company. It's his company. Please note, I showed nothing but respect. But I wanted it to be makes meetings in minutes. Beautiful MMM, because that's what it does. It allows you to make meetings in minutes through this incredible AI software. I wanted it to say that it will design your pitch deck and make it for you in 90 seconds, because that is really, really important and blows me away because of how good it is. And then it adds all these questions that Y Combinator would ask if you do its incubator training. And by the way, Y Combinator is like the Hogwarts for startups. It's insane. I did Y Combinator Startup School, the first one that was ever done. And I go back to it all the time to learn the lessons. But Franco had seen in his, I think 2 years or how long he was doing it, apologies if I've got that number wrong, how people also asked for money models, right? They wanted to know the financial models too. So he wanted to add the word financial models into the tagline. And I fought him on it. I lost because he probably does know better in this case scenario, right? He's been doing it for longer than me. He's in the trenches deeper than I am. But my reason for not wanting it is because of Steve Jobs, because of the remembrance of this vital lesson that removing complexity is how you add value, that keeping things incredibly simple to the powerful things are the stuff that counts the most. Time will tell if I'm right or if I'm wrong. Either way, the software is incredible. The company is incredible. Big thanks and big shout out to www.pitchcapital.com, our headline sponsor for this episode. Anyway, I want you to ask yourself, what are you working on that doesn't serve your core vision? What would you cut out if you were forced to focus only on 4 things? Every single day, I focus on 4 things. I don't allow myself anything else. I do the podcast, speak to customers, I work out, and I work on my relationships. That's it. Sometimes I'll revolve one of those, right? I'll be like, today's a Sunday. I'll do the podcast. I'll work out. I'll work on my relationship. And I won't speak to any customers. So I've got a little space there. What will I do in that space? Maybe I'll add education. I'll read a chapter or something. But I have this app on my phone, and it allows me every day to write the 4 things in. And I look at it and remind myself, those are the 4 things. I call them the core 4. What are the core 4 I will get done every single day? And if you follow me on X, Jason Allen Scott, you'll see that I normally only have 3 written down because people don't need to know about the 4th one. And it's normally, in fact, it's always the same. Work out, speak to customers, work on the product and service. That's it. That's all that counts. This week's challenge, I want you to draw a 4-square matrix for your own business. In 2 columns, I want you to write your equivalent of consumer or pro. In 2 rows, I want you to write your equivalent of desktop and portable. And then I want you to ask yourself, do all your products fit cleanly into these 4 quadrants? And if not, why not? Then ask the harder question. What are you working on that doesn't fit any quadrant? And why are you still working on it? Steve Jobs saved Apple by ruthlessly cutting products that didn't serve the integrated vision. And most were good products. Some were even insanely profitable, but they detracted focus. Your job isn't to build more things. It's to build fewer things better. Integration isn't about controlling everything. It's about controlling the things that matter to delivering the experience you uniquely can deliver. But everything else, say no. Even when it's good, especially when it's good. October 5th, 2011. Steve Jobs dies at age 56 from pancreatic cancer. In his final months, as his body failed, he continued working. When he could no longer come to the office, he held meetings at home. When he could no longer sit up, he traced designs on ceiling tiles from his hospital bed. The night before he died, he looked at his family and said his final words. Oh wow. Oh wow. Oh wow. What did he see? We'll never know until the end. But here's what he left behind. The Apple II, which launched the personal computer revolution. The Macintosh, which popularized graphical interfaces. Pixar, which opened digital imagination. Apple Stores, which redefined retail experience. The iPod, which changed how we consume music. The iPhone, which turned phones into cameras, computers, portals between people, the creator of friendships, relationships, fanatics, sycophantics, and assistants. The iPad, which launched tablet computing. The App Store, which spawned entirely new industries. And Apple itself, which Jobs considered his greatest creation, a place where imagination was nurtured, applied, and executed in ways so creative that it became the most valuable company on earth. But here's what I find most remarkable. And by the way, remarkable just means worthy of remark. Jobs didn't invent any of those things from nothing. He integrated existing technologies in ways others simply couldn't imagine. Xerox created the graphical interfaces. Jobs just made them accessible. Sony created portable music players. Jobs just made them integrated. Nokia created smartphones. Jobs, he made them magical. The genius wasn't invention, just integration. In his own words, we don't invent many things outright, but we're master at putting together ideas, art, and technology in ways that invent the future. People pay us to integrate things for them because they don't have the time to think about this stuff 24/7. If you have an extreme passion for producing great products, it pushes you to be integrated, to connect your hardware and software and content management. You want to break new ground, so you have to do it yourself. If you want to allow your products to be open to other hardware or software, you have to give up some of your vision. That's the choice every founder faces. Integrate and control the experience, or modularize and accept what others deliver. By the way, neither is right or wrong, but one delivers magic. Ford integrated manufacturing to democratize mobility. Edison integrated invention to maintain autonomy. Disney integrated control to protect against betrayal. Walton integrated information to stay ahead of competitors. And Steve Jobs integrated everything to deliver experiences that felt inevitable, only after they existed. The question isn't whether you should integrate. It's what you should integrate and why. What experience are you uniquely positioned to deliver? What would that experience require you to control? And are you willing to say no to everything else? In the next episode, we'll explore a founder who took the opposite path, who built an empire not through integration, but through radical decentralization. Until then, draw your 4 squares and remember, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication.